Those who don't know the Australian Camps Association, I know there's many members here, we really have two key functions. And the first one is simply to help any group from any background whatsoever get access to a camp experience or an outdoor experience. And the second is to make sure that our camps, our member camps, and also the rest of the sector when we can, is best placed to provide a fantastic experience for those groups. So it's really about being the connecting point between everybody and the world of camps. Now I'm old and ugly enough to be of an age when I learnt my trade in the outdoors, it was all about technical skills. You know, you had to learn how to steer a raft or set up a rope or whatever it might be, and there was no thought given to soft skills because soft skills was something that you just had or didn't have, as the case may be. You couldn't actually learn them. And so I've been debating this conversation piece with Mandi for a couple of years now, 4 years or so, and I've learnt, of course, that you can teach soft skills, which we're now calling affective abilities. And in fact, not only can you teach them, they're probably more important than anything else. And I think as we're seeing more and more folks involved in the world of online education or online business, people's affective abilities or their soft skills, their people skills are becoming more and more critical. So without going down the path too far, I'll now pass over to our presenter for the day, Dr. Mandi Baker, who will take us through her latest report. Thanks, Mandi.
Thanks, Pete. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming along and joining us. Now, bear with me as I share screen. I think I've got it all in the right spot. You can read my welcome notes. There we go. Welcome. I want to say thanks for coming and making the time and joining us today. Today we're going to be looking at one of a series of studies that we've been looking at about the affective abilities of outdoor leaders. My name is Mandi Baker. I'm a research fellow at Torrens University, Australia. I'm in a research center called the Center of Organizational Change and Agility. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to look at today. But before I get going too far, what I would like to do is extend my gratitude and say many thanks to my partners, both in the Australian Camps Association and the Victorian State Government of Jobs Precincts and Regions. They have been true supporters and champions of my work for a number of years. I think this journey started 7 or 8 years ago. Before I'd even finished my PhD, I had a very interesting conversation with David Strickland, and it set me on a path of doing research that I'm very passionate about with the outdoor sector. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what affective abilities are, talk to you about the bigger picture of the studies that I've been doing, and then start to focus in on the national survey, which is sort of one of the pieces that we've completed and we're still working through. I'll talk about the findings, it's 4 areas of the findings from that, and then talk about the, you know, as good outdoor people, the what, the so what, and the now what. So then I'll talk about sort of the so what and the now what, where we're going next. Okay, affective abilities. So Australian outdoor leaders deliver organized outdoor experiences from a number of perspectives for a number of reasons. There's educational, recreational, tourism, and therapeutic purposes, and all have been included in this study. I use a term called leader, and I use it in a generic sense here. It's to encompass the many roles that are involved in service or program delivery. Outdoor leaders usually hold some degree of or some level of tertiary education qualification, as you'll see, and they usually work in a day-to-day capacity with participants and in the hope or the intent of facilitating positive nature, community, individual relationships. And to be successful at this and to do it in a way that is meaningful and safe, outdoor leaders rely on their affective abilities. And we define affective abilities as the interpersonal and intrapersonal abilities required to influence the development of positive relationships. And from my research, we've been able to determine that there's sort of 6 key groups or collections of these abilities: facilitation, leadership, interpersonal, intrapersonal, reflection or reflective, and judgment. And it's the combination of these and the fluidity of these in the on the spot, in the moment that outdoor leaders are engaging in. But why care? I mean, why care about affective abilities in our current climate? Well, there's a lot of good arguments to care. Increasingly, employers are emphasizing the need for graduates to be equipped with soft skills to enable them to actually be effective in the workplace. And what you're seeing on your screen is a few icons representing a Deloitte's report. It's not too old, it's 2017, that suggests that 2/3 of all jobs will be soft skill intensive by the year of 2030. That current demand for soft skills exceeds supply for up to 45%. And a quarter of employers have difficulty filling entry-level positions because applicants just don't have the soft skills that they need. This report also suggested that Australian businesses spend approximately $4 billion on training and another $7 billion on recruitment every year to employ staff with the skills that are required to perform in job-related tasks. A more recent report from McCrindle, an education report, tells us that parents and teachers want to future-proof students by developing stronger people and leadership skills. And that we actually need to prepare the next generation for a future where technology and automation make the majority of their work reliant on interactions and connections with others. The outdoor sector is uniquely positioned to deliver this kind of learning opportunity to participants and clients. So much so that many organizations and business deliver programs focused on developing leadership and good citizenship, and they articulate as much in their marketing materials. Yet, somewhat ironically, these same businesses and the sector as a whole seem to be facing the same struggles to recruit leaders with the needed affective abilities to deliver these programs. So the outdoor sector faces issues like high turnover, and we can talk about one of the reasons why I think why that's happening, of frontline leaders. They face significant issues of demand or supply of leaders that have highly developed affective abilities. There's anecdotally quite a lot of complaint and discussion about the low or poor training of new graduates, and a number of frustrations around performance management of staff and how to do it. So we start studying it. What can we find out? What do we need to know? Broadly, the collection of studies I've been doing are looking at 5 things. One is to understand the demands of the work setting. What's going on? What do these people actually need to do? The next is the characteristics of the workspaces and the clients, the people that they're working with and the space in which they're working. Third is the readiness of employees. Fourth, the role of leadership in facilitating these. And when I say leadership there, I mean upper management. And fifth, the role of training. In particular, this research aims to look at these 3 things. One, and which we've already completed, was about how affective abilities are taught or prioritized in the Australian tertiary education outdoor qualification providers. Then it was to explore the views of outdoor leaders and their managers about which skills are used and how valuable they actually are in the field. And finally, what we're still aiming to do is to develop innovative, effective, and pedagogically grounded affective ability development opportunities for future leaders. So we've at this point, it's sort of stretched out to 4 stages. Every time I get through one stage, I think, oh, you know what, we should really look at this too. And you'll hear through this presentation, I'm a research nerd. I do love my time in research. So stage 1 is complete. This is where we looked at all of the curriculum across higher education. So that included universities and what's called VET in Australia, that's vocational education training. So in other countries, the equivalent would be the college or community college level. We looked at all the curriculum to try to understand what was being taught, how it was being taught, what was seen as important. What we're going to talk about today is stage 2, which is a national survey to try to figure out, well, how much of these affective abilities are important and what do the people in the field actually think. We've completed data collection for stage 3. That's a case study to go as in detail and in depth as we can to try to understand affective abilities. And stage 4, I'm currently and constantly trying to figure out what's the strategy for how do we take what we know and give it back to the sector in a way that they can use it and train and work with themselves and their employees to make affective abilities, you know, important, prioritized, and trained. There's been a number of outputs, and you can see there's like a few different lines. Some of them are still works in progress, but there is some publications out there from the previous stage and this current one. And I believe, talking to Jess, she's going to email you links to today's presentations report, so that you can look into it with a bit more detail. Or, you know, snapshot it if you need a good argument to your institution as to why this needs to be a focus in your space. So let's jump in. This is about the national survey is what I'm talking about today. This national survey set out to ask 3 questions. How do outdoor leaders perceive the importance of affective abilities? How do outdoor leaders use their affective abilities? And what are the affective ability training needs of outdoor leaders? So what do we need to do next? This in the research world is called a mixed method integrated survey. This is both quantitative and qualitative data being collected at once along the same lines, so that we're trying to keep the story lines as clean as possible. Data rarely goes along the way you hope, but this means we use numbers and stories to put this, this research together and try to understand a bigger picture of what's going on. Here's a little bit of survey respondent characteristics. This is sometimes called demographic information. And it gives you an idea of kind of the people who responded. So the majority of people responding were between the ages of 25 and 44. There's a pie chart below if you want to see the breakdown in more detail. Most employees who responded were full-time employees, 56% were full-time. And the sectors or the areas of the outdoor industry that responded, or the purpose of their programs, 43% were outdoor education, 35% recreational. And this would suggest that we have, I had far less respondents from the tourism and therapeutic fields. Potentially arguable that there's less numbers of those kinds of programs and therefore employees working in those fields, but also still trying to find the reach, trying to get a survey out to all those good people can at times be challenging until they, you know, they get a whiff of it, and then they, you know, they're more attuned to the next time you ask for their thoughts. Qualification-wise, 25% with a Cert 4, which is the vet level, and 23% with a bachelor degree. But you'll see the pie chart below with qualifications shows we had a good representation of all kinds of qualifications, everything from the I don't have a formal higher education to in this field. They might have it in a different field, but the question was about a related field, all the way through to I would say a fairly good representation of postgrads that were engaging in this. The other 2 pie charts below that you'll see there that isn't summarized is the states. And in Australia, this, for those internationals, Australia, this can matter in terms of the states at times function in very different ways. A large number of respondents are coming out of Victoria, and arguably there are more programs and more staff, but they also seem to have a lot more activity and presence in terms of organizing bodies and the kind of conversations that are happening there. So easier to reach by sending a survey out through those channels. Then we follow with New South Wales, potentially a population representation here with Victoria, New South Wales, and then Queensland. Some of the smaller states and territories had lower response rates. I know there's a few people online from WA, and I know we tried our hardest to get some higher response rates from a couple of these sort of smaller areas in terms of population outdoor programs. So we'll keep trying. We'll get there. On the far right, you'll see years of experience. And again, really good representation across many years of experience, everything from fairly inexperienced or less than a year to over 20 years of experience. And I really was pleased to see this because it meant that we were collecting a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different voices. Cool. What did we learn? Like I said, there's 4 things I'm going to talk about today. If you've got questions, wonderful. I can break some of this down later in those questions, but this is fairly summary information. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is the orange blob on the right. The respondents said that they use their affective abilities 79% of an average day. I would argue that we know where the other 20% goes. The 10% in the morning when you're getting the gear out and working through the program objectives and trying to figure out who has what allergies, yet generally speaking, leaders on the ground leaders are doing that on their own. Then their day starts and they use their affective abilities all day long. It's something that is present, is real, is going to be part of every kind of communication or interaction. And then the other 10% that isn't affective abilities is usually when people are packing up the gear, filling out the incident reports, and kind of putting the day away. So what this would argue is that affective abilities and their use is a part of the everyday. Then what you'll see below that is a somewhat rainbow version bar chart of the rankings of importance of affective ability. And they rank through 9, what we tried to derive were 9 behaviorally based, recognizable activities that clearly used affective abilities in the outdoor sector and outdoor leadership. So in order is communicating effectively, learning from experience, role modeling, decision making, managing one's own emotions and values, collaborating with others, and that includes peers, managers, and stakeholders, building and maintaining relationships with others, managing conflict, and facilitation of personal connections between participants. And this list is drawn up from the research of the previous stage and sort of is translated across into these sort of activities, these things that we see on the ground out there. Now, what's worth noting in the numbers, and you'll see that across the bottom of the bar graphs, is the numbers are really not that different in terms of statistics. We have a 4.7, essentially 6.9, and going down to a 4.15 out of 5. These are rankings out of 5. So basically everybody's saying all of them are really important, and we heard that loud and clear. All of these are really important to the daily ins and outs. What we did get, and this is somewhat supported, well, somewhat, is completely supported by, but also drawn out of the qualitative material, is that communicating effectively was seen as the #1 most important, and potentially the vehicle for everything else to function. That if, as an outdoor leader, you couldn't communicate effectively, none of the other stuff really mattered, because you wouldn't be able to get that affective ability and its intention across the gap between you and the participant, or you and the teacher leader, or you and your peers. So communicating effectively here is clearly ranked as #1. Now, I asked this question in a few different ways in the survey. One where I said, just tell me whichever ones are important. And then another question that said, I'm controlling your responses, tell me the top 3 most important. There's different ways that we can run ranking data. And once I forced people, because most people said everything's important. And then once I forced people to prioritize and really, tell me what's important, what's your top 3, this is where this ranking level comes from, and where we can recognize that communicating effectively sits at the highest. And you can see how that sort of goes down the list from there. Cool. We can slice and dice that data a number of different ways, which is wonderful. We can ask questions like, does that list change based on the role of the person who responded? So if they were an outdoor leader, did they see that list of what's most important as different from managers? We can ask that question a few different ways. Is it different based on state? Is it different based on the program purpose, or the sector that someone works in, or the business that they work for? And I'm going to show you a couple of those. This one here is about role, and you can see that outdoor leaders see the top 4 in the list. And the reason why there's 4, by the way, is because number 3 and 4 tied, and then when I went to the managers, number 4 and 5 tied. So you get these kind of slightly longer lists than I planned. But outdoor leaders say the communication component, communicating effectively, then learning from experience. And just a side note, the learning from experience is about reflective practice. This is the ability to have an experience, sit back, go, what do I learn from that? And then how do I change it for the future? 3 is about role modeling, so that your behavior is always showing your participants or the clients what it is you're expecting of them. And then number 4 here was facilitating the personal connection between others. This is often about getting program participants or clients to connect with each other and to get that sort of community learning aspect going. Managers have the exact same list in almost the exact same order, with one exception. They add in decision making. So managers expect that the frontline people have good decision-making skills. And this is worth taking a moment, and it's probably not a surprise, but that managers want their on the ground staff to be good decision makers, but on the ground staff doesn't actually notice or realize that that is so important. So that gap potentially between managers expecting good decision making and the people who are doing it not realizing that that might be the skill set that their manager wants or expects. It's also, just as a side note, probably more anecdotally, what I hear the managers most frustrated about is judgment and decision making. You know, how do we get these guys to have better judgment? You know, and yeah, fair. It's a good question, but we will come to that in time. The same question, like I said before, what is the importance of affective ability by state? And look, this is again a very similar picture. I will comment, I'll take the moment to comment on the groupings of, say, WA and NT or SA and Tasmania. I know that these are different spaces. I'm not grouping them together in a sort of, oh, they're the same generic kind of approach, but due to the response rates, they were just too low to analyze by themselves with being able to say anything with confidence. Once the number's under 30, there's too much space for mistakes, for error rate. So grouping them makes it possible to analyze them. Once I ungroup them, then I can analyze it, but I can't feel confident about what I'm learning from that. So my apologies if that grouping doesn't suit you. But what we do see, even when they are grouped, is that the top 3 is almost the same for every state, with a couple exceptions. I think yeah, there you go. So there's consensus that the most important affective abilities are communicating effectively, role modeling, learning from experience, and decision making. The only exceptions here is the tied for 3rd place in both Queensland and the New South Wales and ACT grouping is managing emotion. So it appears that in these 2 states, there's more conversation or awareness, or perhaps just a priority on that idea of you as a leader need to manage your own emotions and values in order to deliver that program that is anticipated or expected. And here's a qualitative comment. It kind of helps sum this one up. I could tick all as soft skills. Like these are way more important to an outdoor leader than any hard skills. Hard skills on activities are simply tools that we use to evoke an experience, but I feel beyond those skills we teach. The underlying life skills, such as communicating effectively with others and managing your own emotions in all situations. This is why a focus on facilitation is so important in training. And I think, you know, this author is trying to emphasize the idea that these are all really important, that the outdoor experience and the hard skills are what I call technical skills that are necessary, provide a vehicle and provide an environment and an experience, but it's how we help frame and shape and facilitate that experience through our emotional or social intelligence as leaders that make a huge difference, if not all. Right, okay, so now we're moving on to another way of looking at the data, and this is the frequency of affective abilities, or the frequency of the use of affective abilities. And the list that you see beside the bar graph is a list of behaviors I would argue are typical of being encountered on a daily level that require that an outdoor leader engages and uses their affective abilities. And so I'm going to give you sort of a summarized version of it because it's a bit of a complex graph, but happy, like I said, to have good chats about this later. The first 6 items down the left-hand side are all participant behaviors. Things like participants being anxious or fearful or overwhelmed, participants being lonely, homesick, or left out. These are, you know, fairly frequent, everyday items, activities, behaviors that outdoor leaders will facilitate and work their participants through. And as a summary of all 6 items, I asked the question of how frequently do you encounter this on an everyday kind of level? And what I found is 44% responded as occasionally. You think, okay, fair enough. 32% said often, and then another 5% said always. So that's the combination of all 6 items, the summary there that you've gotten. So that's saying that most people see this pretty frequently in their day-to-day facilitation practice, these behaviors, and need to use their affective abilities to move people through it, or the participants through it. The next the next 3 items, so items 8 through 10, are the peer behaviors. And I was writing peer behaviors like, your peers disagree with you, your peers don't follow yours or other people's directions, your peers don't perform their work satisfactorily. Because we know that it's not just the participants or clients, it's who we're working with, who we're working for, where we're working. And what we find here, and this was not quite what I expected, so it was delightful to find, is that 48% say seldom and 33% say occasional. And that would suggest that peers, for the most part, have a kind of an opposite or a buffering effect to the demand of the other behaviors that draw on affective abilities. That if you work with people that, are performing well, and they're saying, they're saying in this data that they are, that actually can buoy the outdoor leader, give them support and help them get, through the other items, work with the other kinds of behaviors that show up. That's pretty exciting. Sorry, I find that super exciting. That's a research nerd moment for me, where I'm like, wow, it's not what I expected, and I'm thrilled. There is a component here about stakeholders, and it appears for the most part that, because stakeholders can be challenging, they can come with different expectations, but it appears also that this is 48% seldom and 33% occasional. So stakeholders' expectations and their influence or interruption to the program seems to be fairly minimal, and outdoor leaders don't have to engage with it too much in terms of, managing those dynamics. But very important, I think, here is to raise the one about personal emotion management. It's the second from the last line, and it says you have to ignore or manage your own wants or needs to deliver a program. And this could be emotional management. It could be also sometimes physical. Like, I can remember when I was an outdoor leader needing to go to the toilet and then like having to hold it for a couple hours and be really uncomfortable because it just wasn't going to work for the kids if I walked away. So, these kinds of funny dynamics, but they're definitely challenging, and they certainly push outdoor leaders. And what we found is 25% said seldom, so you think, okay, good, but we got 39% at occasional, 26% at often, and 4% at always. And it makes me wonder, why is it, are there 30% of people that are constantly or fairly, frequently through the day trying to manage their own wants or needs? Is it potentially a misfit? We have somebody working in an environment or on a program that isn't a good fit for their own self or skills or personality. But there's also definitely questions about, the employer, the business, the organization. Are they setting it up, the work up in a viable, sustainable, ethical way? Or are there some, conflicts or issues, showing up there that is making it really hard for those employees to be themselves and to have their needs met, or to be able to meet their own needs in those programs? And of course, the question then is as well, I'll talk about that in a second, or I can get myself too sidetracked, as Pete always reminds me. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. This is about the intensity of affective abilities, and really what I was asking was about the personal encounters with critical or intensive incidents. Recognizing that when these kinds of moments come up, that they are quite intense and challenging for the outdoor leader to facilitate. And of course, that outdoor leader is facilitating far more than the acute critical incident or the people involved in the acute critical incident, but they're also managing, the ripple effects on community and the company and everybody else. So the question was about how, have in your career, and keep in mind I had respondents in over 20 years, so in your career, have you encountered any of these? Tick all that are applied. So you'll see at the top a participant injury or illness that disrupts a program. This isn't just the sniffles. This is when injury or illness causes the program to stop, and you have to address it before everybody else can move on. But you'll see the next most encountered is mild mental health episodes. And we know from literature that there's a significant increase and a climbing trajectory of mental health issues among children, youth, and young adults. So I'm not surprised by this coming up as the sort of second of this list, but potentially just that much more evidence to support the fact that our outdoor leaders are facing a lot more mental health issues, and certainly also raising the question of, are they prepared for that? You know, if we know that's happening over there in the literature, are we training over here to meet that increasing need? Some of the other behaviors: participants running away, bullying or harassment, participant quitting a program, participants with significant mental health episodes. And so this is when I would talk about an acute psychotic incident, where the behavior is disruptive in the sense of the program has to stop and there's potentially termination of the program for the people involved. Participants' disclosure of harm, which is a little bit surprising that that there's been that much encounter. That's just short of half the people in the survey having encountered disclosure of harm and having to take the steps that follow that. Termination of a program due to group dynamic issues. You know, there's just the dynamics and you can't get the participants to, settle in. Remote rescue removal. So this is, that's self-explanatory. Harmful, unsafe, or dangerous use of drugs, which includes alcohol, and then not applicable. It's just fairly small, the number of people who have not encountered one of these things or more. But you can see in the top two that, over 80%, almost 90% of all survey respondents have encountered mild mental health episode or injury or illness that disrupts the program. So at the point I was sort of starting to get onto before and I cut myself off, I'll bring it up here. We know that there is a degree of respondents in the survey that work in the outdoor sector in a therapeutic capacity. And so by consequence, they would anticipate, and I would hope be well prepared for encountering a number of these kinds of critical moments. But that was a fairly low number of respondents overall. So given that percentage of the responding population is fairly small, this is suggesting that most people working in outdoor education or recreation are encountering a large degree of these kinds of moments. And for those who have worked in the outdoor field, and I'm assuming that's most of the people on the webinar today, we've all had moments, I'm sure, that have been challenging, and hopefully we can draw on those moments to even think about how complex the interpersonal, intrapersonal skills you need to have in terms of the acute facilitation of these critical moments, as well as the following days. I would go as far as saying the chronic follow-up. Certainly when I've worked in some really critical moments, I know that the next 3 days, as I'm filling out paperwork and calling all of the relevant support networks and drawing in those wonderful help, people, I still have to take care of myself because I'm a bit of a brain fog and emotionally all over the place and trying to find my own center again too. So these kinds of moments certainly do challenge a whole workforce when it has a ripple effect through it. This beautiful quote. For me, the most important thing is to remain present and mindful and respond to challenging interpersonal situations with sensitivity as they arrive. This can be challenging as we're often working under conditions that could be described as intensive, or challenging. Removed from friends, family, and our usual support networks, working long hours with little time alone to process and reconnect with self, little leisure time, doing a mix of physical and emotional work that can be draining. The challenge as I see it is to remain calm and connected under these conditions. And if I succeed in this, I'm usually able to respond effectively to most situations. And this author was responding to the question from the bar graph we were just looking at. But it raises a couple of things I want to draw your attention to. Actually, I'll draw you to two and then keep moving. The first is, this is a Herculean job. This is a massive, demanding job. If this is what we're all supposed to achieve in any given moment, it's a near impossible job. In sense of the conditions are very challenging. The problems that are coming up are very challenging. and the individual themselves doesn't always have a lot of the time and space they need to, you know, recenter, reground, recoup, and be able to address these challenges, these really challenging moments well. So this is a really good reminder of how intense and how challenging this job is, and perhaps an equally good argument as to why outdoor leaders need to be well supported. The other thing that this raises is another stream of research that I do that is, you know, parallel, if not well intertwined with affective abilities, and it's called emotion work or emotional labor. And it's that idea that we use our emotions and that they are necessary to be used in the interchange of delivering an expected or promised experience for client. And those expectations and those promises are often made or assumed by a whole host of stakeholders. It's not just a simple interchange between the outdoor leader and their participant. There's lots of other players in the picture who are making kind of promises on behalf of the outdoor leader that still need to meet and deliver to that expectation. So it's worth pursuing if you're interested. It's definitely worth dipping your toe into the emotional labor, emotion work space of outdoor leaders as well, because it informs the kind of work that's going on in here. And I would argue part of the conversation about burnout and turnover in our field has a lot to do with the emotion work. There's a few people who've been authoring about it in the academic world. It hasn't always gotten as much airplay as it potentially needs to, and watch the space. I've got more to add to that pile too in the near future. Okay, so what are the needs? What are the training needs? And what I'm showing you here in these two images is a little bit different, and I'll tell you why. On the right-hand side, you'll see the responses on the survey. I basically say, okay, tell us what we need to train people on to be good with their affective abilities in the outdoors. And what you'll see, number one, without contest, is communicating effectively. So great, that lines up with every other bit of data that came out of this survey every single time. Communicating effectively, number one. So we can all go, yep, we need to train effective communication. Cool. But what survey respondents said next was managing conflict. And managing conflict was not rated high. In fact, it was either last or second last in every other question. But when asked what people needed in terms of training, they said, oh, you got to train them on conflict. And I think that is this contradiction is a bit of a problem, and it raises some flags. That in fact, managing conflict is a reactive skill set, and that all of the other skills are the proactive ones. That if you're communicating well and you're role modeling and you're making and facilitating great interpersonal connections between your participants, if you're building and maintaining good relationships, that you should never arrive at a point where conflict is such a degree that you're in a conflict management moment. And that perhaps rather than spending the energy and training on managing conflict, which also suggests sort of a deficit model, like wait until it gets bad and then intervene, versus here's all the positive proactive behaviors that you can engage, that should lead you to a positive outcome and never get to a point of conflict management. So for example, you'll see in this list, being able to manage your own well-being and decision-making as the next two. So if we take managing conflict and say, okay, we hear you, but we're gonna put that a little bit lower on the list based on the rest of the other data, then decision-making and judgment, which is making good decisions before we get to the conflict stage, or managing your own self and your own emotions, if we can teach and train and really put our energy in that, then that managing conflict might be more like crisis management study or training versus like this is what we're going to spend our energy on, is this kind of reactive skill set. Let's put our energy into training for the proactive skill sets. And I love the quote on the left. It saves me having to say it. We used to say that these abilities couldn't really be taught. That is a fallacy. They are taught. We teach them to participants and clients in the outdoors all the time. We just need to turn it on ourselves and then maybe up the ante a little bit in terms of what we expect and how we do it. So what do we come away with? Well, a couple of things. Affective abilities is a huge part of everybody's every day, 79%. Outdoor leaders need to be equipped to encounter a diverse range of interactions that are considered unusual and emotionally intense. We know that the top ones on the list are communicating effectively, and if you don't remember anything else from today's presentation but that, I'm good. I'm happy with that as an outcome. But role modeling, learning from experience, so this is reflective practice and decision making or judgment. And then students, new recruits, and experienced leaders should be given training and refreshers in affective ability to support the work they do. And I can say this after spending plenty of time on it, this kind of stuff never gets old. You don't need to do all affective abilities on the first day. You can have a new bit to look at and work on together every week, and you'll still be looking at new material. So I have some recommendations to the outdoor sector or to the broader sort of public. The first thing that we need to do is change the mindset that people skills cannot be taught. And if I can conquer Pete in 4 years, then I can get to a few other people, okay? I'm gonna try. Higher education providers really should embed affective abilities into their curricula, and I mean, this is the special word here, explicitly. It needs to be explicit. There's tons of AA work being done in curricula. It's just being done implicitly. And unless you draw attention to teach the language or build the mindsets around affective abilities, that good stuff that you're training is going to go whooshing through out the back door of students. They need to know what they're learning and talk about what they're learning for it to actually stick. And this is what we know from education literature. Support organizations and managers with understandings on how to recruit, train, develop culture, that's an important one, and evaluate performance of affective ability of staff. Managers want these tools. They're a little anxious, a little hesitant. I've definitely listened to a number of managers saying, but it's so personal, I can't talk to them about their listening skills. That's so personal. It'll be like a personal attack. And it's like, well, no, you need to frame it up the same way that you do about tying a knot so that someone is safe. You need to talk about listening so that someone is safe. It's the same outcome. We want our participants to be safe. We want them to have meaningful, positive experiences. And it comes from our ability to listen and communicate as much as it is to tie a knot. So you can set it up and you can scaffold it, sequence the learning of how to listen. The same way you would sequence the learning of how to paddle a canoe. You don't throw your new time canoers into swift water and tell them to stern. You get them in the boat in a little pond, so it doesn't matter how much they capsize. You get them to paddle in the front. I love my kids, but nobody sterns but mom until they're ready, right? And then we'll get there. Anyways. And we need to help schools and parents and clients actually understand the value of affective abilities. We need to pull out the McCrindle report and say, you guys said this is what we're doing. And we are so fortunate and uniquely positioned in the outdoors to actually train this stuff. So we need to, I think, proudly shout it. These are a bit more strategy based, but for other stakeholders, outdoor leaders should learn affective abilities in part for the buffering effects of what that offers us in terms of the emotional demand of the job. Okay, we know this, that when people are competent and confident in their affective abilities, they're much better at dealing with emotionally demanding moments, and they're less personally affected by it. So they deal with the issue and they keep cruising on. But the ones that don't have competence or confidence or some good combination thereof can be really affected by how, if they didn't manage that moment well, it will haunt them. A lot of our outdoor leaders are very altruistic people. They generally pick the profession because they see the purpose and the passion. They don't usually pick it for the hours or the money. So you've got people who are already going to beat themselves up if they don't do a good job by somebody. It's time for me to wrap up. I can see the clock and I'm waiting for Pete to give me one of these. Come on. So outdoor leaders also need to take responsibility for their own self-care, to create boundaries. I'm a big advocate for developing mentorships. I think that's a huge step. And if you as a manager can do that and pairing your staff with people who have more experience, more seniority, or combination of, brilliant. For managers, guess what? Your job's not over. You need to develop affective abilities and role model it, and role model learning them. So if you stop learning affective abilities, then why would your staff keep going? So they need to see both the role modeling of them as well as the role modeling of learning them. Managers should include affective abilities in the job description, in the performance review, in the, it's an integral part of the story. Looking to match the right skills of affective abilities with the program need, but also that has a lot to do with the last point, which is about scheduling rest for staff that's proportional to the demand. You can't just keep churning these guys through. They're going to burn out, they get tired, they move on. Or you can't just keep churning them through with so little in our infrastructure, unfortunately, so little for promotion. You're going to have to find ways of sharing responsibility rather than sending them up the chain. So there's these different HR strategies for supporting affective abilities. I'm going to stop talking there, bring on the questions.
Wow, thanks, Mandy. That was a really very pretty little presentation too. Lovely slides, well done. And I think probably the first presentation I've been to for some time that didn't have the word COVID in it anywhere. So thank you for that.
Oh, we could harp on about COVID, but let's make this a day of
No,
hope and
that's
positivity.
not a challenge. that wasn't a challenge.
Right, fair enough.
Are you happy for your email address to be published in case folks want to contact you after? Okay, so we'll do that, Jess. Perhaps you can pop it up on the screen.
Yeah, and
if there's any
probably
questions now,
laureate one, Jess, the one with laureate would be best. Thanks.
Okay, so there's a question from Jamie there. I don't know if you can see that in chat. Maybe.
Okay, why do we see outdoor leaders engaging well with clients in the group, but finding it difficult to do the same with themselves? Yeah, okay. What a good question. I was just reading through the details if you haven't seen it. I knew you guys were going to ask tricky questions. I just didn't know that we were going to start in the deep end. Thanks, Jamie. I think our first, it's a nerdy research way of putting it, but the self-select bias. The people who choose to be outdoor leaders tend to be highly altruistic. And they're highly altruistic because they're driven to be in the work or in the job because of the purpose, the clients, the intrinsic motivation, so the feel good, or the intrinsic reward, the feel good moment of being involved. But by consequence, what you have is people who tend to be biased towards giving. The givers. I am included in this pile. I probably am somewhat motivated to do this research because I too have experienced giving to the point of burnout. And so that question comes up. Recently was talking to someone who talked about that as a personality trait. So you're almost working contrary to your own personality if you're trying to draw boundaries. How do you create boundaries when as a personality you have a tendency to give, to want to help, to be rewarded by that feeling of help? And so that makes this particularly challenging. But what we actually teach the new and up and coming leaders is to give. We don't teach them to self-care, even when they're teaching others how to self-care. So they can, it's wonderful. I'll bet that there's enough people on this conference itself who could be like, oh yeah, I'm really good at preaching this stuff, but I'm not particularly good at acting it, following what I'm saying. So the other part I would argue about the level of burnout that we're seeing is it's not just the individual. And I think that's a bad habit that comes out of what we call the medical model of always seeing the person who's burnt out or the person who's ill as being the broken component. And if we look at the patient as not being the broken component, maybe contributing factor, but that there's other parts like context, like in this case, discourses, or the working environment that creates an expectation of giving until you're broken. And I write about this in a book that I published. Now I did the study on summer camp counselors because I thought, oh my goodness, does it get any more insanely demanding than the overnight camp when 16-year-olds are in charge of 10 10-year-olds? I mean, as a parent, I would never have 10 children of the same age at the same time. I would just say, no, that's insane. And if someone offered to pay me 50 cents an hour, I'd still say no. So, this is a pretty unique environment. And what I learned is that there are certain messaging that is very assumed for outdoor recreation, outdoor education. And that messaging we take up on a personal level, somewhat uncritically, and it gets jammed in there. So one of them, for example, in the outdoor field is the message that if you don't go hard, if you don't finish that camp, if you don't finish that hike or that paddling trip, if you call it because the weather's bad, you're weak. There's something wrong with you as a leader. And then there's issues in terms of, you know, being liked by your peers. There's issues of being seen as not being competent or capable enough as a leader. And a lot of that battle is very internal. And because we're not talking about those discourses as openly and as comfortably as perhaps we should in the outdoor industry, those discourses continue to influence, and it never gets disrupted. It never gets retold, re-narrated in a way that's more potentially compassionate or supportive. Some of the research, for example, about outdoor leaders as women who talk about kind of competing with this notion. It's not even the men, it's this notion that if they don't perform on a really physical level, they'll be seen as less competent. So it's not just the individual, despite the fact that we have these beautiful givers, but it's also in the systems around us, in the structures and the policies, but also in our storytelling, what we call discourses. So that's a long answer, but hopefully it helped.
There's more coming, Mandy. So Liz Horn-Haley has asked, is there a potential that we expect too much of ourselves? Is there an element of not actually knowing what the ripple effect, or just moved as I was reading that, is post-program?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We do definitely expect too much of ourselves. And I will have a COVID moment now. COVID has made that abundantly clear. That COVID has sort of, you know, taken a hit at everyone's emotional tank, and then I've certainly found myself going, well, why can't I just get that done? Because I'm so used to, especially as an outdoorsy person, just get it done, like just give her, and the energy's not in the tank, and that it creates what we call a strong constitution. Some of these outdoor experiences create this resilience and this strength, but the strength can equally be a weakness when we don't reasonably reflect and proportion the circumstances against the energy required, and do I really have it? So in our household, for example, we were talking about, Liz, you probably know this, about how many carrots. I have no more carrots to give. Now, this was a conversation with my 9-year-old because she couldn't understand why mommy and daddy weren't doing everything for her as we were, you know, mashing our way badly through homeschooling and the rest. And we had to say, look, we just don't have any more carrots to give. And when you don't have more carrots to give, you kind of just have to stop, plant some seeds and grow them. You can't just keep going. But as to outdoor Eddie parents, that was a shock to us as much as it was to her to see us slow down. So that's definitely in the pile. And is there a ripple effect after program? Definitely. That's not going away. But there's definitely also an attitude by employers that contract's done, I don't have a responsibility for them anymore. And this was seen in my previous research. It's called the post-camp blues. The level of depression camp counselors were experiencing after the summer season was over was significant, yet it was happening a month, 2 months, you know, counterculture shock when they went back home and couldn't figure out why their parents weren't as lovey-dovey as their experience at camp, and then they'd have their crash. And there was no one there for them. There was no support. Now that's starting to change because social media means that camp communities can stay linked and conversing after the season's over. But it's not necessarily conversing as in, hey, are you going through depression? Me too. How do we sort this moment out? And unfortunately, there's also this sense by employers that because I'm not paying them anymore, the ripple effect is not my problem. So again, as an industry, we probably have to look at that. Hi, PT.
Yeah, so PT, there's a lot of stuff there. I might share that stuff with you later on too. I've got some information on that, and I'm sure Mandy has as well. But in the interest of time, I'll just also move on to Laurie's question.
Nice to meet you, PT, face to face. We've been emailing back and forth and having conversations, so nice to meet you. I've read other research that talks about the need for more leadership and risk management skills, but I didn't see this here. Do you have an inkling of why? Was it the question here because there is not self-awareness of this need? I'll try to break that down. So when I started on this nice long journey, I went into the literature, into the data, looking for the opposite of hard skills. And when I went into it, what I found is the opposite of hard skills is not soft skills. So we did, it's what we call a literature protocol. We said anything that's hard skills we'll delete, we won't read that stuff. Anything that's not hard skills, that's what we'll read. And what we found out is that there's more than just hard skills and soft skills. And I think everybody who works in the industry goes, yeah, of course, they're not dichotomous, they're not opposites, there's not just two. What we found is that there's a third category. So we call them technical skills, we call it affective abilities, and then we called this thing called conceptual practices. And risk management sits in the conceptual practice part to begin with. Okay, I usually draw it up as a Venn diagram. It's very fluid because we are often all using all of these skills at once. But conceptual practices is sort of more of the, you know a concept and you need to know how to apply it. That's what the practice part is. You need to know how to apply it. And that intersects with technical skills and affective abilities. But that's why the focus on risk management doesn't show up in this lot of literature, because it belongs to another pile. And for the purpose of trying to do research well, sometimes you just have to put fences around it. Whereas this material definitely does include leadership. But leadership is a really tough word to work with because it's very ambiguous. Leadership means different stuff to different people. Some people deal with it a bit like alphabet soup, throw everything in. Other people deal with it in really exclusionary ways. And so for the purpose of this survey and for using a word like leadership on a survey, knowing that anybody could mean anything, I worked more with that 9 lists of behaviors. Because we know that leadership is a part of about 3 of those based on the literature and the research we've done so far. So that lets us speak to the idea of leadership, but without trying to use a catch-all phrase that is a little too tough to work with in a meaningful way. I'm reading as quickly as I can. Oh, you'd like to know about the book? I did, yeah, sure. That came out at the beginning of this year. Yay, that was just 10 years in the making. But it was my PhD, and what I wanted to know was, I wanted to understand camp counselors in the North American setting. And I had in my mind this question of what's going on emotionally for them? What emotional demand are they facing? What is the expectation of the emotional work? And the more I dug into it, the more I started to understand the different, for example, discourses that were saying, well, if you're a good camp counselor, you should be like this. And if you're a good camp counselor, you should be like this. And I was one of those ones who wasn't quite like this or like that. And I couldn't figure out why I didn't fit in the box. And my curious mind said, okay, well, let's figure out why you didn't fit in the box. Turns out most of the people I talked to never felt like they fit in the box. Even the people I thought were the box didn't feel like they fit in the boxes. And so the more I dug into it, the more I started to understand that. So the book is about the emotion work of camp counselors, and my theoretical approach tends to look at something called power relations. What is the relationship and negotiation of power that's constantly happening? And when I talk about power, I don't mean authority or a top-down kind of approach. I talk about how people engage and navigate and negotiate the influence of themselves in their relationship with others. So I'm a sociologist in that capacity. And the more I dug into it, the more I was like, wow, this stuff is fascinating. So that's the book if you want to read it. I'm seeing that there could be a failure at management level at times where we are not managing our staff responsibly, effectively, and safely. Yeah, definitely. And I think the work of management, yeah, I'm going to say that, I don't know how popular, it can be distracting. There are so many things to attend to. There's so many balls to keep in the air and to juggle. That interpersonal connection stuff that usually allows us to listen to and hear to some degree that intuitive voice that says, this doesn't feel right, or this person's being snarky, or that person just had a bit of a tantrum, that we can miss those moments. And whether that's because of our own hesitations of engaging in the messy moments with other people, or whether that's because other things seem to scream louder. Oh, we've got to get that, we've got to get that form back in time, or that we're going to lose that client. And I think that's one of the challenges of being in a management position is there's just so much screaming for your attention. And good relationships require to some degree that we slow down, that we actually be a bit more still, that we engage our reflective practices, that we listen to the that stuff that doesn't necessarily scream until it's screaming, right? Until you've got a whole cohort of staff that are burning out at the same time, which, by the way, that's very normal and common. And that's one of the great, I've had a few phone calls from a few folks in the industry going, I've got 20 staff going down at once, Mandi, what the hell? And I'm like, well, if you're gonna, if one's gonna start burning out, and they live in a somewhat isolated remote area, and they have friendships with each other constantly because that is all that they have access to, or that they choose to be all, you know, uniquely in friendship with their work community. When you've that mutual reinforcement of behavior and thought, you get somebody who's complaining about the workplace and culture starts going down, and you can burn out a whole team in a quick go. So yeah, those are those moments that as managers are screaming, but if we're listening and we're not focused on, for example, conflict management, we're focused on the proactive affective abilities, we hopefully tune in too far before that happens and start moving pieces of the puzzle to make it healthier and better. Look, I know it's 2:03. I can even see the Pete's face is that face that says, stop it, Mandi. So I will.
No, not stop it, but it's something we can talk on all afternoon, I'm sure. And obviously it's hit a bit of a nerve and continues to. So Mandi's report will be on our website, the Australian Cancer Association website. If you look at the bottom of the page, the front page is a tab called Research. You can find it there. Also, if you have any other questions, please just fire them through to either Mandi or Jess, and we'll follow them up after the presentation. And also, Jess will pop out the recording at some point, I think, in the not too distant future. Thanks, Jess. I know it's probably approaching midnight in Quebec, Brian, and it's probably very early in the morning in Stellenbosch, Alan. So thanks for getting up very early or staying up very late. And thanks, Mandi, for your presentation. Thanks everyone else for being here. And we will say until we meet again.